Okay, let's kick off this deep dive. We've talked a lot about the successes of Apollo, but today it's about the mission that became famous for, well, not succeeding in its primary goal, Apollo 13.
That's right. And it all starts with probably the most famous understatement in spaceflight history.
You mean Jim Lovell's words?
Exactly. Just imagine hearing this coming from 200,000 miles away. Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. Calm, controlled, but absolutely chilling.
Sets the scene instantly, doesn't it? Apollo 13 was supposed to be the third trip to land on the moon. They were aiming for a place called Framaro.
A scientifically rich site, the Highlands. It was all planned out for exploration. But then, an explosion on board. Suddenly, it wasn't about lunar geology anymore.
No, it became about survival. Pure and simple, getting 3 astronauts home from deep space with a crippled spacecraft.
And that's what we're digging into today. Not just the Hollywood version, but the reality documented in things like the Apollo Flight Journal, the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal, and especially the detailed timelines in Apollo by the numbers.
These aren't just stories, they're records of incredible problem solving under pressure. The sources show the safe return wasn't luck. It was built on layers and layers of planning, documentation, and human ingenuity.
Absolutely. So our mission today, if you will, is to understand how this potential catastrophe turned into what's often called the successful failure. How the crew and the ground teams, through these valiant efforts, as the official reports say, pulled it off.
And the people involved, the crew itself. Commander Jim Lovell, already a space veteran from Apollo 8.
Right, and Fred Hayes, the lunar module pilot who later flew the Space Shuttle Enterprise tests, and Jack Swigert, the command module pilot, who was actually a late substitution.
We'll definitely get into that. And on the ground, you had legends like Gene Kranz, the flight director, really marshaling the forces in mission control.
And you can't forget Ken Mattingly, the astronaut who was originally supposed to fly but got grounded. His work in the simulators back in Houston was absolutely critical later on.
So, it's a story about the crew in the capsule, yes, but just as much about the massive team effort back on Earth, turning procedures and manuals into a lifeline.
Precisely.
Hmm.
This deep dive is all about peeling back those layers, looking at the redundancy, the training, the sheer brain power that turned documented knowledge into a rescue plan. Apollo 13 really stress-tested everything.
Okay, so before the crisis hit, let's set the stage properly. What was Apollo 13 supposed to achieve? Why from Amaro?
Well, it ties back directly to the big picture goals of the entire Apollo program. Remember, it wasn't just about planting a flag.
Right, there were 4 main objectives we've discussed before.
Exactly. First, develop the technology for space travel itself. Second, achieve that national preeminence, the space race context. Third, conduct real scientific exploration of the moon. And fourth, develop the human capability to actually work out there in that hostile lunar environment.
And Apollo 13 was heavily focused on that third goal, the science bit.
Very much so. Fermaro was thought to contain ejecta, material thrown out from the massive Imbrium Basin impact billions of years ago. Landing there would give geologists a window into the moon's deeper, older history. It was a prime scientific target.
So a really important mission scientifically. Now, about the crew. You mentioned Jack Swigert was a late replacement. What happened there?
That was some serious pre-flight drama just days before launch. The original command module pilot was Ken Mattingly. He'd trained with Lovell and Hayes for months, maybe years.
So they were a tight team.
Very much so. But then the backup crew comes into contact with the prime crew, as they always do, and Charlie Duke, who's on the backup crew.
Later walked on the moon with Apollo 16.
That's the one. He caught German measles. Now, Lovell and Hayes had immunity, but Mattingly didn't.
Oh, wow. So the flight surgeons got involved.
They did. And the risk was that Mattingly could come down with measles during the mission, potentially during a critical phase like, lunar orbit or reentry. NASA couldn't take that chance.
So they had to ground him, just like that.
Just days before launch. It was a tough call, really tough on Mattingly, obviously, but mission safety rules were rigid. You had to follow protocol.
And in steps, Jack Swigert, the backup CMP, how much notice did he get?
Officially, about 3 days, which is incredibly short notice to step into a prime crew role for a lunar mission. The command module is a complex beast.
That speaks volumes about the training program, though, that the backup was expected to be ready to go on such short notice.
Yeah, it absolutely does. Swigert was fully qualified, no question. He knew the systems inside and out. But, that specific crew dynamic, the rhythm they'd built up over months of training, that inevitably changes.
But the mission went ahead. The schedule was paramount.
The momentum of the Apollo program was huge. They had launch windows, operational targets, Grounding Mattingly was a disruption, but delaying the whole mission would have been a much bigger one. So Swigert slotted in, and they pressed on.
And the launch itself, April 11th, 1970, atop that monstrous Saturn V rocket. How was the public mood by then? Were people still glued to their TVs?
You know, it's interesting. If you look back at the coverage and the general feeling, maybe less so than Apollo 11 or even 12. By Apollo 13, 10 crewed Apollo missions had already flown, counting the Earth orbit ones and the 2 successful landings.
So, bit of been there, done that, creeping in.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
There was this sense, maybe even a dangerous sense, that lunar missions were becoming, well, routine, almost commonplace, which, when you think about the sheer complexity and risk involved, is kind of wild.
That's the dramatic irony, isn't it? The mission where the public was maybe least engaged was the one where everything went wrong.
Exactly. Perfect setup for the drama to come. Complacency is always dangerous in exploration.
Before we get to the bang, let's just quickly recap the vehicle itself, the hardware that became so crucial.
Sure. So the Saturn V blasts them off, and then you have the 3 main spacecraft components traveling to the moon. First, the command module, the CM. For Apollo 13, it was named Odyssey.
That's the crew's living quarters, the control center, and the only part designed to come back through Earth's atmosphere, the pointy bit.
The pointy bit, yeah. Attached to its base is the service module, the SM, big cylinder. That's got the main engine, the big propellant tanks, and crucially, the oxygen tanks and the fuel cells that provide power and water.
The support section, basically, and then tucked away initially is the third part.
The lunar module, the LM Apollo 13s, was called Aquarius. This spidery-looking thing was designed purely for the lunar landing part of the mission. Take 2 guys down from lunar orbit to the surface, support them for like less than 2 days, and then blast the top half back up to rendezvous with the command module.
Built for a very specific, short-duration job, not for keeping 3 guys alive for days on end across deep space.
Absolutely not. Keep that in mind. So the first couple of days of the flight, everything goes pretty much by the book.
Smooth sailing, following the flight plan, hitting the marks. The timelines in Apollo by the numbers show it was all nominal.
Check, check, check.
Yeah.
They did the transposition and docking maneuver, pulling the LM out of the rocket's 3rd stage. They were on course for the moon, doing routine system checks, housekeeping, just like the missions before.
About 56 hours into the mission, just over 2 days out from Earth. Still on track to meet those scientific goals.
Yep. Completely unaware that their mission and their lives were about to change irrevocably. That Aquarius, the little lunar lander, was about to become the most important lifeboat in history.
Okay, so here we are, day 3. About 56 hours into the flight. What was the specific event that started the cascade?
It was something incredibly mundane, actually, a routine task. Stirring the cryogenic tanks in the service module.
Cryotanks. That's the super cold liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen.
Exactly. Liquid oxygen for breathing, obviously, but also both oxygen and hydrogen fed the fuel cells. And the fuel cells generated nearly all the electricity and water for the command and service modules.
So pretty vital stuff. Why did they need stirring?
Because in zero gravity, the super cold liquid doesn't settle nicely at the bottom like it would on Earth. It kind of floats around, gets stratified into layers of different density. To get an accurate reading of how much propellant was left, they had small fans inside the tanks to stir the contents, make it uniform.
A standard procedure done on previous missions.
Oh yeah, multiple times per mission usually.
Yeah.
Just part of normal operations for the service module systems.
So the call comes up from Houston. Okay, 13, we'd like you to stir the cryotanks.
Right. And Jack Swigert, who was on duty in the command module at the time, flipped the switches. And then,
The bang.
yeah, Lovell described it later as a pretty large bang. Not just a pop, but a solid jolt that shook the whole spacecraft stack.
Immediately alarms start going off.
What did they see on the control panel? What was the first sign of trouble electronically?
A master alarm light came on. And crucially, they saw a major voltage drop on one of the main electrical buses, main bus B. Then warnings about the fuel cells. 2 of the 3 fuel cells located in the service module just died, almost instantly.
Okay, that's serious. Losing 2 out of 3 power sources. It's critical. And the data flooding into the cabin and down to mission control was confusing. Alarms for low pressure in one of the hydrogen tanks, then alarms for the oxygen tanks. Specifically, oxygen tank number 2 showed quantity readings plummeting, then pressure readings dropping fast.
But wasn't there some thought initially it might just be an instrumentation problem? A sensor glitch?
That's often the first thought, especially with weird readings. Swigert initially reported it quite calmly, "Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here." Then Lovell came on and said, "Houston, we've had a problem." He repeated it, confirming it wasn't just Swigert seeing things. But yeah, for a few moments, they were working through the procedures for instrument failures. Maybe a sensor got knocked offline by the bang?
But the problems kept cascading.
Exactly. Oxygen tank 2 quantity went to 0. Then, terrifyingly, the pressure in oxygen tank 1 also started to drop steadily. Now remember, both tanks feed all 3 fuel cells.
So if tank 1 goes too,
They lose everything, all power, all water generation, and eventually the oxygen supply in the command module itself. The situation went from puzzling to catastrophic very, very quickly.
meanwhile, back in Houston, what's happening in mission control?
Absolute controlled chaos. Red lights flashing everywhere. Controllers are staring at their screens, seeing data that just doesn't make sense. Power fluctuations, pressure drops. The whole ground support system, the flight directors, the specialized controllers like ECOM managing electrical systems, GNC for guidance, TelMe for the LM systems, they all snapped into emergency mode.
Reliant on their training, their documentation.
Completely. Their response was dictated by years of simulations, by the technical debriefings from previous missions, by the deep knowledge of the systems documented in their manuals. They had procedures for multiple failures, but this combination was unprecedented.
They needed clarity. What broke the confusion?
The visual confirmation. Mission Control asked the crew to look out the window, see if they could see anything.
And Lovell looked out.
Yeah. He maneuvered the spacecraft so he could look back at the service module. And that's when the penny truly dropped. He reported seeing a gas, venting out into space. He said, "We are venting something. We are venting something out into space."
Not an instrument failure then. Physical damage.
Undeniable physical damage. The service module was bleeding its lifeblood into the void. That visual report cut through all the contradictory data. They knew. Crew and ground control knew simultaneously this was a catastrophe.
And the first casualty, beyond the hardware.
The mission objective, landing on Moon, was gone. Instantly. There was no way to continue to Fra Marat with a dying service module.
The focus shifted entirely.
100%. From lunar exploration to survival. They had to immediately change their thinking, change their trajectory. Forget landing. How do we get these guys home? It became the ultimate test of the spacecraft's redundant systems, and crucially, the human capability for rapid response and improvisation under unimaginable pressure.
Okay, so the SM is venting oxygen. Power is plummeting in the command module Odyssey. What was the immediate make-or-break decision?
The lifeboat strategy. Power down the command module completely to conserve its remaining entry batteries and move the crew into the lunar module Aquarius, using it as a temporary home.
Using the LM as a lifeboat. Had this ever been simulated? Was it part of the standard contingency plans?
Not to this extent. There were procedures for using the LM systems in certain limited emergencies near the Moon, but not for keeping 3 men alive for the 4-day trip back around the Moon and home. It was truly unprecedented.
Why was it so risky? You mentioned the design limits earlier.
Right. Aquarius was built for 2 astronauts for about 45 hours. Minimal life support, minimal power, minimal water. Now, they needed it to support 3 astronauts for, well, it turned out to be about 90 to 100 hours, almost 4 full days.
Double the crew, more than double the duration. That's pushing the systems way beyond design specs.
Massively beyond. Everything was suddenly critical. Oxygen supply, water for drinking and cooling equipment, battery power, and, as became famously clear, carbon dioxide removal.
So the first step was shutting down Odyssey.
Yes, a rapid but careful power down. They had to transfer the guidance data from the CM's computer to the LM's computer, then shut off almost everything in the command module to save those precious batteries needed for re-entry, the only phase the CM could handle. Essentially, they put Odyssey into a cold, deep sleep.
And then physically moved into the LM.
All 3 of them crowded into Aquarius. Remember, it was designed for 2 people standing or floating, not 3 living for days. It must have been incredibly cramped.
And all their survival now depended on the LM's systems documented in NASA's technical manuals and flight plans, but now being used in a way never intended.
Exactly. The LM's environmental control system, its batteries, its communication gear, even its small descent engine. Everything had to be managed with extreme precision, rationing every watt of power, every drop of water, every breath of oxygen, based on what the engineers on the ground could figure out from the documentation.
Let's shift focus to Houston then. Gene Kranz and the team in Mission Control, what was the atmosphere like there?
Intense, focused, determined. Kranz famously drew a line. He declared to his team, in essence, that they were not going to lose the crew. That failure was not an option. It wasn't just a catchphrase. It was a command decision. Work the problem. Don't guess. No. Find the answers in the data, in the procedures.
And they mobilized everything they had.
The valiant efforts mentioned in the reports were real. Krantz organizes controllers, bringing in the experts on every system. They formed these dedicated groups, later nicknamed Tiger Teams.
Tiger Teams, what did they do?
Each team tackled a specific critical problem. How do we minimize power consumption of the LM? How do we stretch the water supply? How do we navigate using the LM's limited systems and visual cues? How do we manage the thermal balance in a power-down spacecraft? And critically, how do we write entirely new procedures for things that had never been done before?
So they weren't just executing existing plans, they were innovating on the fly.
They were diving deep into the documentation, the LM's mission rules, the technical debriefings from engineers, those system schematics. They had to understand the absolute limits of the hardware, find margins that weren't in the standard operating manuals, and then figure out how to communicate those complex new procedures clearly to a cold, tired crew hundreds of thousands of miles away.
It sounds like an incredible exercise in applied knowledge management under the highest possible stakes.
That's a great way to put it. They had to comb through every available piece of technical information, from the Apollo spacecraft and systems familiarization guides to the detailed performance data of every valve and battery cell. The LM was designed with certain redundancies, but they had to figure out how to leverage every single one, often in combination, to keep the crew alive.
And power was one of the first big hurdles, right?
Mm-hmm.
Making the LM's batteries last 4 days instead of less than 2.
Absolutely critical. The LM had descent stage batteries and ascent stage batteries.
Mm-hmm.
They needed both, and they needed to use them incredibly sparingly. The Tiger team responsible for power basically tore up the standard LM flight plan. They identified everything, non-essential cabin lights, instrument displays, even some heaters, and instructed the crew to turn them off.
So the spacecraft got cold. Very cold.
Freezing. We'll get more into the conditions later, but yes, power conservation had immediate, harsh consequences for the crew's comfort. But it was necessary. They calculated the absolute minimum power draw needed to run the environmental controls, the communications gear, and the navigation computer for crucial course corrections.
Course corrections. Weren't they already on a path back to Earth?
They were on what's called a free return trajectory.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, if everything failed after leaving Earth orbit, gravity would eventually swing them around the moon and back towards Earth. But the explosion had likely nudged them off that perfect path slightly. And they also wanted to speed up the return journey if possible, to minimize the time the LM life support had to last.
So they needed to use the LM's engine.
Yes, the descent propulsion system, the engine normally used to land on the moon, they needed to perform at least 2 crucial burns. One major burn shortly after swinging around the back of the moon to get them back on the optimal trajectory for Earth re-entry and potentially shorten the trip. And then smaller tweaks later.
But navigating and controlling a burn like that, using the LM, without the main guidance system of the command module, how did they manage that?
Again, ingenuity from the ground teams. They worked out procedures for the crew to align the spacecraft manually, using the Sun and Earth as reference points through the LM's small windows and alignment telescope. They calculated the exact burn duration and timing. It required immense skill from the crew, flying by the seat of their pants based on instructions radioed up from Houston, instructions derived from deep analysis of the LM's propulsion systems, specs, and navigation capabilities documented back on Earth. It was teamwork at its most extreme.
So they're in the LM lifeboat, conserving power, making course corrections, but new problems kept cropping up. Let's talk about the most famous one, the air quality.
Ah, yes, the square peg in the round hole. This is probably the most iconic example of the ground team's problem solving. So the lunar module Aquarius had its own system for removing carbon dioxide, the CO2 the crew exhaled.
Essential for survival. CO2 buildup is poisonous.
Exactly. The LM used cylindrical canisters filled with lithium hydroxide to scrub the CO2 from the air. But remember, it was designed for 2 men for less than 2 days. With 3 men exhaling for 4 days, those LM canisters were getting used up way too fast.
And the CO2 levels started climbing inside the cabin.
Yes, rising towards dangerous levels. They could track it on the monitors. If it got too high, the crew would become impaired, then unconscious, then worse.
But didn't they have spare canisters in the command module, Odyssey?
They did, plenty of them.
Yeah.
Odyssey was designed for the long haul, so it had a good supply of lithium hydroxide canisters. But there was a problem.
The shape.
The shape. The command module used square canisters. The lunar module system needed round canisters. The fittings were completely different. You couldn't just plug a square CM canister into the round hose connections of the LM's environmental system.
So they had the solution right there, literally feet away in the dormant command module, but they couldn't use it.
It seemed that way initially, an absolutely maddening situation. But this is where the ingenuity of the ground crew really shone. A dedicated Tiger team was tasked with figuring out how to make the square canisters work in the LM, using only materials they knew for sure the astronauts had on board.
What kind of materials are we talking about? What was documented as being available?
They literally gathered up examples of everything listed in the spacecraft's inventory checklists and the handbook of pilot operational equipment. Things like the cardboard covers from the flight plan books, plastic bags, the kind used for storing equipment or personal items, hoses from spacesuits, and crucially, gray duct tape.
The duct
The
tape.
hero of the story. So this team on the ground, working with duplicates of these items, essentially invented an adapter. They figured out how to use the cardboard to build a sort of box structure around the square canister, use the plastic bags and hoses to direct the airflow, and then use the duct tape to seal it all together, connecting the square canister assembly to the LM circular hoses.
They built a Heath Robinson device, basically, out of space junk.
Pretty much. And they had to figure it out quickly, then radio the step-by-step instructions up to the crew. Imagine Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert, cold and tired, carefully assembling this contraption based on verbal directions from Houston.
And it worked.
It worked beautifully. They got the adapter built and installed, and soon the CO2 level started dropping back down to safe levels. It's an absolute brilliant piece of improvisation, completely reliant on knowing exactly what bits and pieces were available on board thanks to meticulous documentation. It kept the air breathable in Aquarius.
Incredible. But solving the air problem didn't make the journey comfortable, did it? What were the conditions actually like inside that LM?
Grim. Really grim. To save power, they turned off almost all the heaters. The LM had very little insulation compared to the CM, so the temperature inside plummeted.
How cold did it get?
Close to freezing. Reports vary, but maybe down to 3 or 4 degrees Celsius, like 38 Fahrenheit. It was bone-chillingly cold. And because it was so cold, condensation formed everywhere. Water droplets beaded up on the walls, the windows, the equipment panels, everything was damp.
Not exactly ideal for complex machinery or for people.
Not at all. And on top of the cold and damp, they were severely rationing water. The LM had a very limited supply, meant only for cooling electronics and maybe a few sips for the 2 lander crew members. Now, 3 guys needed it for 4 days, and they still needed water reserves for cooling the CM electronics during the final power-up.
So dehydration was a serious risk.
A huge risk. They were limited to maybe 6 ounces of water per person per day. That's barely anything. They were thirsty, cold, exhausted from lack of sleep. The LM wasn't exactly designed for sleeping arrangements for 3 and under immense psychological stress.
It really hammers home that Apollo goal, developing human capability to work in hostile environments. They were certainly doing that.
Absolutely. Following complex, newly devised procedures, making critical judgments, all while dealing with extreme physical hardship. It wasn't just about the hardware solutions. It was about human endurance and discipline. Their training really paid off in just being able to function under those conditions.
Okay, so they've got air, they're managing power and water, they're on the right path home. But the biggest procedural challenge was still ahead, wasn't it? Waking up the command module.
Yes, the re-entry power-up. This was arguably the most complex and critical sequence devised during the entire crisis. Odyssey was their only ticket through Earth's atmosphere, but it was frozen, dead, running on minimal internal battery power meant only for the final hours.
And the standard procedure to power it up from cold would use way too much battery.
Far too much. The normal checklists involved bringing multiple systems online simultaneously, which created huge power surges the depleted battery simply couldn't handle. They risked draining the batteries completely before they even got the essential guidance and control systems running for re-entry.
So they needed a totally new power-up sequence.
A completely bespoke one, written from scratch under immense time pressure. And this is where Ken Mattingly, the astronaut bumped from the flight, became instrumental.
Working in the simulator back in Houston.
Exactly. While the crew shivered in the LM, Mattingly, along with John Aaron and other engineers and controllers, practically lived in the command module simulator. They spent something like 30 straight hours experimenting. How could they bring the systems online one by one, in just the right order, sipping power instead of gulping it?
They were essentially reverse engineering the power-up based on the system's absolute minimum requirements.
Precisely. Which circuit breakers needed to be closed? In what sequence? How long did they need to wait between steps to let voltages stabilize? Which non-essential systems could be left off entirely until after splashdown? They meticulously documented every single step, every switch throw, creating a novel checklist pages long.
All derived from the fundamental schematics and technical specifications. Not finding a hidden procedure, but creating one based on deep system knowledge.
That's the critical point. It wasn't in any existing emergency manual. They built it from the ground up, relying on the foundational documentation, the Apollo spacecraft, and systems familiarization manuals, the electrical diagrams, everything. It was a masterclass in understanding the machine at its most fundamental level.
And then they had to radio this incredibly complex, untested procedure up to the exhausted crew.
Imagine Jack Swigert, the command module pilot, receiving these instructions, knowing that if he made one mistake, flipped one switch too early or too late, it could drain the batteries and doom them all. The pressure was immense. But this procedure, born from the ground team's mastery of the documentation and Mattingly's tireless work in the simulator, was their only hope for a safe return.
Right, we're in the final hours now. The crew is back in the freezing command module Odyssey, ready to execute this brand new, untested power-up sequence.
The tension is just palpable when you read the transcripts from this phase, detailed in the Apollo Flight Journal. They've jettisoned the crippled service module, and just before that, the lunar module Aquarius, their faithful lifeboat.
They had to say goodbye to Aquarius. Must have been a poignant moment.
Definitely. Fred Hayes apparently said something like, "Farewell, Aquarius, and we thank you. It had kept them alive." But now, Odyssey had to do its part. So Swigert starts methodically working through Mattingly's checklist, bringing the command module back to life, step by painstaking step.
And when they jettisoned the service module, that was the first time they actually saw the extent of the damage, right?
Yes, that was a huge moment.
Yeah.
As the SM drifted away, they could see it clearly. An entire panel, about 13 feet long, was just gone. Blown clean off. You could see the mangled equipment inside, the ruptured tanks.
Must have been horrifying. Visual confirmation of how close they came.
Absolutely. Lovell famously radioed down, "There's one whole side of that spacecraft missing." Seeing that damage really brought home the violence of the explosion and raised the stakes even higher for re-entry. If the blast damaged the command module's heat shield, which was right next door,
then re-entry would be fatal. The heat shield was everything.
It was their only protection against the searing heat of hitting the atmosphere at 25,000 miles per hour. Any significant damage, any cracks or weakened spots from the explosion shockwave, and the CM would burn up.
So they've powered up Odyssey, they've aligned for re-entry using the last dregs of power, and the procedures worked out on the ground. They hit the upper atmosphere, and then silence.
The re-entry communications blackout. It's a normal part of any return from space. As the spacecraft plows into the atmosphere, the intense heat ionizes the air around it, creating a sheath of plasma that radio waves can't penetrate.
How long does it normally last?
Typically around 3, maybe 4 minutes for an Apollo re-entry. But for Apollo 13, everyone knew the stakes were infinitely higher. Was the heat shield holding? Was the trajectory accurate enough, calculated correctly by the sleep-deprived teams?
Mission control just had to wait.
Agonizing silence. 4 minutes passed, which was maybe the expected maximum. But still no signal. Every second must have felt like an hour. They were relying entirely on the physics, the engineering, the integrity of that heat shield, and the valiant efforts of everyone involved.
Did the blackout actually last longer for 13?
It did, slightly. Because they came in on a shallower trajectory than usual, partly due to the unique return path. The blackout stretched out longer. It lasted closer to 5 minutes, maybe a bit more. That extra minute or so just ratcheted up the tension in mission control to an almost unbearable level.
And
then finally the crackle of static and confirmation of signal acquisition. They were through the worst of the heat. Cheers erupted in mission control. But it wasn't over yet.
Still needed the parachutes.
Exactly. The final step. First, the drogue chutes to stabilize and slow the capsule, then the 3 huge main parachutes. When those distinctive orange and white canopies blossomed against the blue Pacific sky visible to the recovery forces, that was the moment of absolute triumph.
Splashdown. Safe.
Safe splashdown. The timeline documented in Apollo by the numbers concludes right there with the recovery of the crew. They had done it. Against all odds, they had brought Apollo 13 home. Failed to land on the moon, yes, but achieved something perhaps even more remarkable.
So looking back, Apollo 13 is this incredible story, but it's defined by that paradox, isn't it? This successful failure.
It really is. The mission failed its scientific objective completely. They never got near Frau Morrow. But in terms of NASA's absolute #1 priority, crew safety, it was arguably their greatest success. Bringing that crew back safely demonstrated the depth of the entire program.
It wasn't just a single point of failure, it was a cascading series of problems, and yet the system, both human and mechanical, held.
Exactly. It stands as one of the 11 crewed Apollo missions that flew, and its contribution to the program's legacy is immense, even without a landing. It proved the value of redundancy, of contingency planning, and of rigorous training.
And it really validated the hardware design, didn't it? Especially the lunar module.
Absolutely. The modular design of the whole Apollo stack, the command module, the service module, the lunar module, proved crucial. The LM wasn't designed as a lifeboat, but it was robust enough, and its systems well documented enough that it could be adapted into one. That flexibility saved them.
But beyond the hardware, the real takeaway seems to be about the human element, the knowledge, the procedures.
I think that's the deepest lesson. It wasn't duct tape that saved Apollo 13, fundamentally. It was the thousands of pages of documentation, the schematics, the test results, the mission rules, the endless hours of training and simulation. It was the codified knowledge and the ability of the ground teams, the flight directors, the controllers, the engineers, guided by resources like the Apollo spacecraft and systems familiarization manuals, to access, interpret, and apply that knowledge under extreme pressure.
They didn't have the internet, they couldn't Google the answer. They had binders, charts, and their own expertise.
Precisely. They had meticulously prepared documentation, and they knew how to use it. When the unexpected happened, they didn't panic. They systematically worked the problem using the tools and information they had rigorously prepared beforehand.
It makes you think, doesn't it? We often talk about moonshot thinking for big, ambitious projects, but maybe the real lesson of Apollo 13 is about the power of meticulous preparation and deep technical mastery.
I agree. So here's a final thought to leave you with. The Apollo 13 recovery was achieved using only the information documented before the crisis hit. They solved seemingly impossible problems by mastering the available technical knowledge of their systems. Now think about the complexity of systems we deal with today in technology, in infrastructure, in medicine. How many impossible problems might we be able to solve if we truly committed to that same level of rigorous documentation, deep system understanding, and procedural mastery? Perhaps the most powerful tool we have for tackling future crises is the knowledge we systematically record and learn to apply today.